Good afternoon. Welcome to yet another very topical and very timely EMET webinar. After a very prolonged and rather bumpy electoral process, it looks clear by now that Joseph Biden will be the 46th president of the United States. It is the view of many that President Trump has been the most pro-Israel and pro-Jewish US president that Israel has had thus far. We can all go down the list and tick off the many amazing things he has done for Israel and the Jewish people, including, but not exclusive to, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, withdrawing from the disastrous JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, publicly canceling the Hansen memo and saying that the settlements are not per se illegal under international law, shuttering the Palestinian mission in Washington, drying up the funding to the PA and to UNRWA, the December 11th, 2019 executive order saying that Jewish students have the same rights under the Constitution of the United States as any other minority group. And just last week, where Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called BDS an anti-Semitic cancer and threatening to withdraw money from institutions that support BDS. And that is not a comprehensive list. We have many questions. We have assembled today a panel of three of the most intelligent and experienced analysts who live and work in Israel, to tell us about how they feel the relationship between the United States and Israel will be under a Biden administration. Here with us today are Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, someone who we work closely with, and we have since the beginning days of the Oslo Accords. Yoram was the former Minister of Congressional Affairs at the Israeli Embassy, and prior to that, he was the Counselor General at the Southwest Israeli Consulate. And he is the president now of the American Israel Opportunities, a highly sought out consulting group who meets regularly with members of Congress, members of Knesset, and journalists. And I have to say, whenever Yoram comes to Capitol Hill, we help to arrange meetings for him, and people, especially people that have worked with him from the old times when he was the Minister of Congressional Affairs, are jumping out of their seats to meet with Yoram Ettinger. Of course, we have Alex Traiman. Alex is the Managing Director and Jerusalem Bureau Chief of JNS.org. He has the finger on the pulse of everything that is happening, both within the United States, within Israel, and within the Israeli Knesset. He's written scores of articles and has directed and produced major films such as Iranian and the Honor Diaries. And Alex is also a brilliant writer. And Ruthie Blum, who's my newest friend here, is an editor of GNS and is a highly published and respected columnist whose columns regularly appear in JNS, the Jerusalem Post, Israel Hayom, the Washington Times, and many other periodicals. She's the author of the book To Hell in a Handbasket, Carter and Obama and the Arab Spring. And beyond that, she is also a really talented and brilliant writer. And I find myself nodding my head in approval about everything that she writes. So let's start with you, Yoram. I'm just going to make the first question very open-ended. Is this good for the Jews? How is Israel, and how are the relationships between Israel and the US going to be, as far as you know, under a President Biden?
Well, in order to understand the significance of the change of guards in Washington, especially in the White House, but to an extent also on Capitol Hill, one needs to be, in my mind, familiar with the cultural battle which has been going on in the US for the last few decades, intensifying during the last few years. And that's the battle generally between the major urban centers and small town and rural America, flyover America. It's a battle which has to do with the cancel culture, which has become more and more visible in the US, the revisionist history, and that has to do with Israel, because once you have a more powerful cancel culture movement, you distance yourself from the biblical roots of the USA, you distance yourself from the foundations of the very special, unique attitude by most Americans towards Israel. You also cancel culture, among other things, the statues of Moses and the statues of the Ten Commandments throughout the USA, as well as in the US Supreme Court, in the US House of Representatives, in the US Library of Congress, etc. It's also a battle between cosmopolitan America or internationalist America on the one hand, and America first on the other hand. And certainly that has an impact on US-Israel relations, because just like any other allies, Israel also wants America to be stronger. Because the stronger is America, the more secure are America's allies, and the more America highlights multilateralism, the more America, in a way, sacrifices the independence of its own action of national security, which follows in the footsteps of Europe, which has been characterized by growing vacillation and appeasement. This is not a major tailwind to America's allies, a tailwind to America's foes and to rogue regimes. When it comes specifically to the new administration, one can judge it by the track record. There's no better evidence as far as the future than the track record of the past. The number one person who will be there to formulate President-elect Biden's foreign and national security policy will be Anthony Blinken, who has been with Biden since his days in the Senate, through his days in the Obama-Biden administration. And Anthony Blinken is a so-called known commodity. Anthony Blinken is driven by human rights, which is certainly a very positive feature, but when it clashes with realities, the complex, the unpredictable, the very violent realities of the Middle East, as we saw, for instance, in the Libyan episode, which Anthony Blinken, at that time National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden, was one of the key guys pushing for the Libyan policy back in 2011, which toppled Gaddafi and transformed Libya into one of the major platforms of Islamic terrorism, unlike the pre-toppling of Gaddafi, when Gaddafi, in many, many respects, was transformed into a ruthless warrior against Islamic terrorism. Gaddafi transferred his nuclear infrastructure to the USA, but human rights preoccupation drove the US to shatter the Gaddafi's regime, which toppled the regime, and it was replaced by certainly non-human rights followers, multitude of Islamic terrorist organizations that roam today all over Libya. This will be, in my mind, the policy in some variation towards Egypt, where during the Obama-Biden day, They courted the Muslim Brotherhood, which, by the way, is the #1 Islamic terror organization. They stabbed the back of President Mubarak, and they were very cold towards General Sisi, the one who did free Egypt of the hold by the Muslim Brotherhood. This probably will be the policy towards Saudi Arabia. Blinken already made it very well known that he intends to reassess policy towards Saudi Arabia due to human rights issues in Saudi Arabia, most notably the killing, the murder of Khashoggi. He's also very upset with Saudi Arabia military involvement in Yemen, by the way, where they are involved against Iran, which meddles in Yemen, threatening, aiming to topple the House of Saud. Blinken is also very upset with Saudi Arabia policy towards Qatar, which is an ally of Iran, the top financial supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, an ally of Turkey's Erdogan. And certainly we'll see a changed policy towards Iran, which will lift not all, but many of the sanctions, and thereby funneling or channeling mega billion dollars to the Iranian machine of terrorism, subversion throughout the Middle East, and in fact, all the way to South and Central America today. And last and not the least, the issue of the Palestinian problem. Blinken has already made it clear he does regard the Palestinian issue as a central topic on the Middle East agenda. Once again, he approaches it through the human rights channel, and in my mind, underestimating or maybe ignoring the hate education, terroristic track record of the Palestinians going back way before 1967, and probably most importantly, the track record of Palestinian intra-Arab terrorism, which has transformed basically most Arab countries into anti-Palestinian state policy followers. Last and not least, Antony Blinken has made it very clear that in his own way, he is very much for Israel. He made it very clear that neither him nor President-elect Biden would use the so-called foreign aid, which is really an American investment in Israel, as a tool to squeeze territorial concessions from Israel. He opposes such a practice. However, at the same time, he also is a person who believes that dramatic Israeli withdrawal from Judea, Samaria, and East Jerusalem constitute a prerequisite for the peace process.
Okay, so I feel there's going to be rocky waters ahead. And before you went on, we were chatting also. There is unfortunately a new appointment, Rima Dodin, who is self-described as a Palestinian American, and she's going to be the White House Deputy Director for Legislative Affairs. She was in Berkeley, and she led the BDS movement there, and she's very active in the Council for American Islamic Relations, CARE. So on that very sober note, Alex, what are your feelings about U.S.-Israel relations through this?
Well, I think right now you're hearing a lot of people talking about how important it is for the state of Israel to remain a bipartisan concern in the United States in an age in which there really are no bipartisan concerns. Like, we're in an era of polarization of politics, severe polarization of politics, and in a sense, Israel risks being punished for the good that was bestowed on us by President Trump, that there may be a feeling within the administration that Prime Minister Netanyahu had really offended previous President Obama in certain instances, both in the Oval Office of the White House and also obviously in 2015 when he opposed the JCPOA during an address to the joint session of Congress. And then was too cozy with President Trump, who obviously is the political opponent of the Biden regime, and really removed, for 4 years, blocked this new administration from being in power, pushed all those people out, and now they're back. And obviously, President Trump moved several goalposts, and so the question is, how many of these goalposts can an administration move back easily? Which ones can they not move back easily? So I wanted to do a very quick run through, I think, of some of the things that took place and try to gauge what could be reversed, what probably could not be reversed, and what Israel may be likely to expect. So you mentioned several things in your opener, particularly the move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This is something that likely cannot be reversed because it was a U.S. law that the embassy needed to be moved. And President Trump simply enacted that law by not signing a waiver that was a loophole in the law. So basically, President Trump executed a congressional bill. So it can't really be reversed, nor can really the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Also, these things would be direct signal to the Israeli government that there's no commonality at this point between the nations, which is not, I think, what a Biden administration would do. Also, the recognition of the Golan is something that is unlikely to be reversed just because Israel has been in the Golan and annexed the Golan in 1981. And across the border, you have a non-state in Syria. So to say that the state that's controlled it for so many years is going to give it back now to a non-state that can't keep its act together, it's very unlikely. But he did mention that Secretary Pompeo had reversed the 1978 Hansel memo produced during the Carter administration, which called these Israeli settlements a violation of international law. And President Trump and Pompeo, they reversed that and said that settlements are not per se legal under international law. We know already that Joe Biden, who has a long-standing relationship with the state of Israel, has pressured Israel on many occasions over the building of settlements. When he was here in 2010, he very sharply criticized the announcement of building permits in a neighborhood in northern Jerusalem, in the Ramat Shlomo neighborhood, and that's not even over. That's not even in the West Bank. That's in territories that Israel had already annexed following the 1967 war. So they will likely reverse that, or we have to be aware that they may reverse that and now say once again that they do hold settlements to be illegal. Other things that the Trump administration did is that they had eliminated a special consulate that dealt with Palestinian affairs in Jerusalem that actually reported directly back to the State Department and bypassed the ambassador to Israel. So that's something that they could reinstate potentially. Certainly, as Yoram mentioned about the multilateralism of U.S. foreign policy moving forward, you could expect that the United States would reinstate funding to several of the organizations that Trump removed their funding, including UNESCO, for example, and restore funding towards UNRWA. It could restore funding towards the Palestinian Authority as well. Now, we know that, and Sarah, you followed this closely, obviously, for a long time, is the Terror Force Act that predicates U.S. funding towards the Palestinians on whether or not the Palestinian Authority is making payments to members of the Prisoners Fund and the Martyrs Fund, basically those terrorists who were either incarcerated or the families of terrorists that were killed in the act of committing terrorism. So they may say or find different ways of providing funding towards the Palestinians, which may or may not be in Israel's best interest. Now, a key issue obviously is going to be Iran and the JCPOA. We know that Antony Blinken was involved in the negotiations of the JCPOA. and also that Jake Sullivan, the incoming national security advisor, was also involved in secret discussions with the Iranians before the signing of the JCPOA. So we can expect that they would go back into this. The crippling sanctions of the Trump administration had put on Iran were pushing Iran towards potentially a regime collapse, which I think many people believe. It's not only whether the regime has the nuclear capabilities, but what are the motivations of the regime? And if you have a regime that commits itself to wiping Israel off the map, well, that's the problem. The problem is the regime, because many countries have nuclear capabilities, but they don't have motivations of destroying another country. So with regard to Iran also, Israel's been operating rather freely in Syria with strikes. We're hearing all the time. We wake up, we check the news, and Israel struck in Syria as Iran was moving weapons or persons through, that could threaten Israel. So will we have the freedom to operate in Syria the way we did before, or would this administration condemn any attacks that we did in Syria as destabilizing, right? The Trump administration was quiet on that. And of course, at the United Nations itself, people understood with the Trump administration that there was going to be a veto against any major anti-Israel resolution. And what we saw as the Obama administration left, when Kerry was the Secretary of State, that they actually pushed the passage of UN Security Resolution 2334, which called the settlements a flagrant violation of international law. And then they abstained during the vote itself to allow it to pass. And that was a sort of parting shot to the state of Israel, just as the Obama administration was leaving. So the question is, was that an isolated incident, or could that be the starting point for Israel at the United Nations moving forward? Another thing that they cannot really reverse is the right? And now we had heard in recent weeks that as many as 5 to 10 different countries could sign on to normalization agreements with Israel should the Trump administration win. Now they were waiting to see what will happen. Now they probably won't now sign normalization agreements, but what I like to say is that they can slow the process, but they can't slow the progress. Meaning that you might not see the signings of big normalization agreements. However, all of the work that goes on below the surface that comes prior to the signing of a major signing like we saw in the White House in August, that all is going to continue to take place. And I think that the clue that you have that this is continuing is the trip yesterday that was reported that Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Neom, Saudi Arabia. Now, the Saudis are not necessarily ready to sign a major normalization agreement, but clearly the groundwork is being laid towards that. And if the United States will empower the Iranian regime, on the one hand, or take a policy against the Saudi regime, which is in many respects trying to modernize and become more moderate, both of those acts could actually push Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries closer towards Israel. So there might be silver linings. The other thing I would just say from the outset is that obviously Israel did reap many benefits from a very friendly Trump administration, but even an Obama administration did maintain strong security ties with the state of Israel. President Obama always talked about maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge in the region, and also was responsible for the signing of the $38 billion MOU for weapons. So they obviously see the value of the Israel-America strategic alliance, but there's a sort of, the Obama administration was, took the approach of, we're friends, but since we're friends, we're going to try to help save you from yourself. But I would say that in the end, no matter what, Israel really evolved as a regional economic and military superpower during the 8 years of the Obama administration. So the things that America did for Israel during that time helped Israel, and the things that they did that tried to actually hurt Israel, potentially isolating it diplomatically, actually opened the door to many diplomatic relationships and dramatically enhanced our strategic. So I think that the overall strength of Israel today, which is very different than the strength of Israel when President Obama entered office now 12 years ago, is dramatic. And I think that Israel is in a very, very strong position to succeed no matter what a Biden administration puts forward.
Excellent. I love your point about how the overtures towards Iran might actually cement the closeness between Israel and the Sunni Gulf Arab states. So there are, okay, Ruthie, your take.
Okay, well, it's hard to add to what Yoram and Alex already said. So I'm going to talk about internal Israeli politics and how this election in the United States is affecting it and will affect it. Everything Yoram said about the cancel culture in America and the split there between the cosmopolitan side of America and the, I can't remember the word you used, Yoram, but the, make America, excuse me, what word did you use?
America first.
America first. Now, those trends are happening in Israel as well. Israel always or often follows American trends. And the worrisome part is right now, Israel is also split down the middle in a kind of civil war. None of us has yet mentioned the coronavirus crisis, which if you ask me, if it hadn't happened, Trump would have won by a landslide. And Netanyahu in Israel would not be in the same kind of trouble he is. That crisis was not caused by the United States or Israel, and nobody's handling of it. No politician, no medical expert, and certainly not the World Health Organization. Nobody has figured out what to do about this virus, and we're not going to know about it until years in the future when we look back, and we will then see how many ridiculous policies we implemented that were pointless. But it doesn't matter, because if you're a leader during an election year, or as in Netanyahu's case, in a always looming next election, you get blamed. That's what happens when you're the leader of a country. Some people die, people are out of work. That's what happens, even though Trump was extraordinary in his managing not to destroy the US economy, even under these circumstances, and the same goes for Netanyahu. The trouble here is cultural. I think Yoram pointed that out very seriously. And within Israel, you have a real split between the people, not just who hate Netanyahu, but who, like Americans who hate Trump, see, first of all, they're the virtue signalers versus the patriots, maybe you could say. And this worries me because the Israelis in that camp are thrilled to see Trump defeated. They want to see Netanyahu defeated. They would all be happy to see both of those men in jail, though the people who want to see them in jail are often themselves the ones who should have been in jail a long time ago. So the worrisome part, I'll tell you, is also this attitude that somehow Trump gave Israel a gift. Alex just interviewed Pompeo when he was in Israel. And one of the, just right before Alex interviewed him, all the headlines, the New York Times and everywhere else, were saying Pompeo gave another gift to Israel, or a parting gift to Israel by saying that BDS is anti-Semitic, by saying that products from Judea and Samaria will be labeled made in Israel, a gift to Israel. Now, Pompeo told Alex in his interview, basically, I'm just paraphrasing, no, this is a gift to humanity. This is not a gift to Israel. And this is a key point here that I think can't be stressed enough. The reason that America and Israel are allies is the very reason that the Obama administration was so dangerous. Because Obama, though some right-wingers Israeli right-wingers accused him of being anti-Semitic, I disagreed with that all along. No, He is a Saul Alinskyite who is against America. And if you are someone who's against America, you are by extension against Israel. The dim view of America. Now, you could say that Biden doesn't have such a dim view of America. I don't know what Biden thinks. I mean, Biden is kind of a non-entity who was elected because the Democrats understood that if they show their true colors, you know, if they let out the squad, the Ilhan Omars and all that come to the fore, there's no way that they can field a candidate who will beat Trump, because Americans, most of America is not that radical. So Biden is really neither here nor there, although Biden has said and bragged about having pointed to Netanyahu, said, I love you, man, but I don't agree with a damn thing you say or do. And that's worrisome, because it's not just whether Biden reprimanded Netanyahu for, as Alex pointed out, the construction in a little neighborhood in Jerusalem. You know, someone builds a terrace and the left in America is all up in arms. They don't even know what that means, building and settlements, okay? But what's worrisome about it is the attitude that we take, and the Israeli left takes it all the time, that somehow Netanyahu is at fault for causing a rift between Democrats and Republicans on the subject of Israel. Now, this is total nonsense. If anyone caused that rift, it was the Democrats, because they began to see in Israel their worldview that has to do with a dim view of American power, also had a dim view of Israeli power, and had that mistaken, insane, failed paradigm that you cannot have peace, their favorite word, you cannot have peace unless the Palestinians have a state. They never came out and realized or said or acknowledged that the Palestinians don't want a state. I'm not talking about the Palestinians, I'm talking about the leadership. If Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas had ever gotten any of his wishes, he would have been in the dustbin of history a long time ago. And he knows he was kept in lots of money and relevance precisely by lacking statehood. That's what gave him fame at the UN. It gave him recognition all over the world. He didn't want a state. So in any case, aside from the fact that the Palestinian leadership would like to see Israel disappear, even if you don't look at it in ideological terms and you look at it only in terms of corruption and everything, opportunism, it was not in those leaders' interests ever to get a state. So there was no way that any negotiations with them would work. And in fact, they didn't work. And Kerry's whole thing about how no, you can't have any Middle East peace without it was proven to be completely false. And yet, here we go again, Kerry now, so he's been given a little bone. Good, you go and be in charge of climate change. Normally you might say, okay, what do we care? He's in charge of climate change. But we should care for two reasons. One is that an administration that in today's world, not only because of the pandemic, but because of this terrible threat from Iran, today's world says climate is the most urgent thing on the agenda. That's A, worrisome. B, Kerry will also be part of the National Security Council, which is, the point is, John Kerry is a failed statesman who has no business being anywhere near the corridors of power. And yet here we go again. And as you pointed out, Sarah, this woman who's going to be in the, she's going to have more of an administrative role, I believe, who praised suicide bombers. But the point is that even if all these sort of, let's say, even conservatives who are trying to find some hope in this administration, you see it's not really the radicals taking over, it's, the moderates, Joe Biden and Blinken. I think I think they're kidding themselves, because the point is not whether you have, Blinken is a moderate, and Yoram explained that about Blinken. And Blinken may be a really great guy and mean well and even like Israel. And it's so beside the point, because if the attitude is that we need to negotiate with Iran, and the attitude is al-Sisi in Egypt is more dangerous because of his, I'm not saying that al-Sisi doesn't commit human rights abuses in Egypt. Let's not kid ourselves. The Middle East, other than Israel, is not you know, this is not California, okay? So you're right, all of those countries commit human rights abuses, but you have to choose which ones are gonna side with the West and have a better chance of reforming and have a better chance of being on America's side and Israel's side. And we are seeing how that's unfolding now with the Abraham Accords and with Sudan. Sudan has a terrible human rights record. However, as Yoram also pointed out, and Alex pointed out, what about Turkey? What about the radicals in the Democratic Party? They're really great at attacking Saudi Arabia. They're attacking everybody who signed the Abraham Accord, but they're not saying that about Turkey, and they want to renegotiate a deal with Iran. And you know, the point is, this is the danger, and there's this, you know, total doublespeak going on. The point is not, again, the point is not whether you have moderates in the administration, and isn't that wonderful? Now Israel, you know, will be able to talk to those moderates. Netanyahu, throughout his career, has been really good at talking to everybody. Biden and whoever else it is, that's not his problem. The problem here is a worldview and an administration that's going to bring us back to Europe first, you know, the Europeanization of America that took place under Obama, who said outright, we are not a superpower, we are not superior to other countries, we're the same. And you want to say, oh really? America, the United States of America is the same as Greece? Really? Even nice countries? Excuse me, no. And the difference with Trump, and I think that's why the Trump administration showered Israel, gave Israel such a warm bath, not because it was philo-Semitic or what, it wasn't because Trump has Jewish grandchildren. It was because the Trump administration said, we love America. America is there is such a thing as a superior country. And America is one, and Israel is one, and there are other regimes who, if they don't shape up, they're going to be in the cold. And others want to join in, you know, in our sauna, you're welcome. And it worked. It worked. And now, sadly, that's all going to go by the wayside. And the only thing I can think that we have to take, let's say, encouragement in, is that we, meaning anybody who believed in what the Trump administration was doing, is focusing on the next 4 years, building, not despairing, but making sure that within Israel, Israelis don't start drinking the Kool-Aid about bipartisanship in the halls of Congress, and work towards a strong Republican Party and great candidates for 2024.
Wonderful, wonderful. Again, I keep nodding as you're talking, Ruthie. Do you think that the Biden administration is capable of learning from the past mistakes, from the mistakes of the past? And do you think the Palestinians, I mean, we noticed how last week they said that they were deemed to take that tax revenues from the Israelis, which they had halted. They are going to start joint patrols with the IDF. And for a brief moment, they said that they were going to change the pay structure for the prisoners and martyrs. And then we found out on their Facebook page, they said that they didn't really mean this. Do you think they, first of all, the Americans, the Palestinians, or the Iranians are going to shape up or try to obfuscate their acts or actually learn? Do you think they're actually going to learn from our past mistakes? Anybody?
Who are you asking? I mean, I'll answer it really short and then hand the floor over. The short answer is they're not going to learn from their mistakes because they don't consider them mistakes. It's an ideology, it's a worldview. It's not a question of learning from their mistakes. As we've seen, nobody has learned from the mistaken paradigm that land for peace is a lie.
Right. Alex?
When it,
Oh, Yoram.
No, go ahead, Alex, go ahead.
Go ahead. Yoram, go ahead.
Too polite.
When it comes to the question whether President-elect Biden, or more importantly, Antony Blinken, will learn from past mistakes by avoiding or by repeating them. Again, we have to look at the track record. In 2009, shortly after entering the White House, we saw the Obama-Biden administration, which more or less it will re-enter the White House in January. We saw them basing their policy towards Egypt on human rights, siding with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a top human rights violator, while, to be realistic, yes, they fight all over the Arab world against corruption, they fight for more rights, but at the same time, they are the arch terrorists, because the aim is to revolutionize the entire Arab world and establish a pan-Islamic state, not Arab states. We saw a repeat of that in 2011 in Libya, when once again the urge to punish Gaddafi for slaughtering his enemies inside Libya drove US to leave NATO and topple Gaddafi, who, yes, he slaughtered, but he slaughtered Islamic terrorists inside Libya, and he became the #1 warrior against Islamic terrorism in Libya, in North Africa, in Central Africa, in Western Africa. And we have seen it also when it comes to Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned before, with Blinken already mentioning, will hold Saudi Arabia accountable for violation of human rights. Once again, focusing on human rights, which ordinarily would be a terrific act, a terrific value to follow. But if you do that in an overly simplistic way and thereby weaken the pro-Western elements, and you provide tailwind to the most vicious anti-Western, the most vicious oppressive organizations and regimes, this becomes like cutting one's nose to spite one's face. When it comes to the policy towards when it comes to the Palestinians' attitude towards Israel, how many times can you go again and again and test them again and test them again? They have gone through litany of tests. They failed each time. And once again, we hear the overly simplistic, what I call Palestine firsters in Israel and in the US, urging Israel to give the Palestinian one more chance. And as we have seen throughout the years, anytime you expand Palestinian Authority, whether it's in Egypt or Syria or Jordan or Lebanon or Kuwait, you simply doom the host country to a civil war, to a wave of terrorism, which has transformed the Palestinians into a role model of intra-Arab treachery, subversion, and terrorism. And certainly, when it comes to Israel, haven't we learned from the mistakes of the Oslo Accords and then series of other accords? And have we forgotten that the vision of the Palestinians, otherwise referred to as the Palestinian Covenant, was established before 1967, and it has to do with Jaffa and the Galilee and the Negev and the whole of Jerusalem. The issue is not the size of the Jewish state, the issue is the existence or the elimination of the Jewish state. And one more comment, as Ruthie said before, this is not a pro or anti-Israel issue. A Palestinian state in Judea-Samaria would doom the pro-US Hashemite regime east of the river. A Palestinian state in Judea-Samaria would join series of rogue regimes in the Middle East, and therefore no pro-Western Arab wants a Palestinian state. And certainly an Israeli control of Judea Samaria is not a gift to Israel. It serves America's interest because it bolsters or it minimizes instabilities in the Middle East, and it bolsters every single pro-US Arab regime in the area, beginning with Jordan through Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the UAE and Bahrain, which serves America's interest as well as Israeli interests.
Right, right. Excellent. Alex, did you want to just jump in there?
Yeah, sure.
And then Sarah.
A couple of important points. I think that the multilateralism of the American foreign policy is very, very important. To understand what Biden will be, you could just look at the podium on the Biden lectern in the few times we actually did campaign during the last months, and it said the words on it, "Build Back Better." Now, these words, "Build Back Better," are not an invention of the Biden campaign or the Democratic Party. This is a term that's been used by the World Economic Forum for its Agenda 2030 and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And we've actually heard world leaders around the world use the same phrase, "Build Back Better," many times. So if he's putting this on his podium, you're talking about a US president that's saying, no, America doesn't come first. America is going to lead a transition toward global governance, toward a world without borders, in the same way that the European Union was meant to sort of erase the individual nationalities of European countries and create a continental governance. They're pushing towards this type of policy around the world. And so what that does is that actually puts Israel on the other side, because Israel is a country that is committed to very strong and secure borders, that is committed to national pride. It's the only country in the world that speaks this language and has its own unique culture, and also a culture that's based on a religion in a day and age where people have less and less respect for religion. So if you look at where the US might think it made mistakes with regard to the JCPOA or the Palestinian issue, those mistakes can be blamed on Israel. What was the problem with what the United States did with Iran, except that Israel opposed it, and Israel caused all these problems, and Israel stood up inside the Congress, and spoke against the agenda of the international community, and as a result, they actually attracted in these Arab nations that the United States thought that it could manipulate and tell to do what they wanted to do. So, and it's the same thing with the Palestinian Authority. You can talk about Palestinian intransigence, you can talk about the Palestinian incitement to terror, but in that you could also blame the failure of the creation of a two-state solution on Israeli refusal to withdraw from the territories. Obviously, if Israel was ready to withdraw from the territories as it did from the Gaza Strip, ta-da, you would have it, a two-state solution. So it's really can all be scapegoated on Israel, which is, by the way, fuel for tremendous anti-Semitism, and we're now seeing a tremendous wave of anti-Semitism. So that is something to keep track of. But because Israel's position has changed so dramatically over the last 12 years, when Obama came into office, he said to Netanyahu, "I want you to freeze building and settlements for 10 months." And we did that because we really didn't have a choice at the time. We had to, make a gesture toward the Obama administration. We saw obviously that it was a failure. But now, 12 years later, we can turn around and say no. If the Biden administration says, "I want you to do this or that," we see we don't have a problem saying no the way we had before. So that's a little bit of a change in the position. But don't be, when you look at who's happy that the Biden administration is now in office, the Palestinians are ecstatic, the Iranians are ecstatic, the Muslim Brotherhood and Turkey are ecstatic. When you see who's happy about a Biden administration, you can get the sense for what those policies might be, especially when you also see the words "Build Back Better" written on the lectern.
Exactly. Okay, now we just have time for a few questions that have come in, and I apologize if we don't get to them all. Our wonderful Director of Communications, Sarah Leah Thompson, will read the questions that have come in. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all of our panelists for all of your insights. So perhaps briefly starting with Ruthie, one question we received is it possible that the incoming Biden administration may accept the fact that the Middle East has moved beyond the old two-state paradigm and perhaps leverage the Kushner paradigm as a starting point?
No, it doesn't seem likely based on statements made recently, very recently, by members of that administration, by Biden himself. It was a very lukewarm reception to the Abraham Accords on the part of the Democrats, who had to scramble to figure out a way not to totally attack them. Of course, the squad, the real radicals of the Democratic Party, had no problem attacking those accords outright. But other members of the Democratic Party were lukewarm about those accords, and they do not want to give up on their failed paradigm. It's mysterious, I admit, but we have seen how that paradigm is like some kind of gospel there. It's peculiar why it should be, because one wonders why anyone in America would care one way or the other, which paradigm works. But there you have it. And therefore I see no optimism about that. And again, as I said, if you have John Kerry on the National Security Council, no, that paradigm is alive and well.
I would just add there that people should not assume that the Kushner paradigm was not a two-state paradigm. It very much was a two-state paradigm. So you haven't shifted away from that. The only thing that the Kushner paradigm, so to speak, changed was that they said we can't expel 450,000 Jews that live in Judea and Samaria, so we have to redraw the lines around them. But it's still a two-state paradigm.
Thank you for that note. And moving on to Yoram, do you expect there to be any action towards Iran, military or otherwise, by the outgoing Trump administration or by Israel in the next 2 months?
Well, I certainly don't think that neither President Trump or Prime Minister Netanyahu have the liberty to be delinquent on top national security goals or requirements. One does not have to be a Middle East scientist to know that the Ayatollahs of Iran are the #1 threat, not only to Middle East stability and not only to Israel, which they view as the small Satan, but they are the #1 threat to the world at large as an epicenter of the proliferation of terrorism, of chemical, biological warfare technologies, of ballistic technologies. And this proliferation goes into the whole Middle East, Central Asia, Africa, as I mentioned before, South America. The triangle of Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil is a major center of Ayatollah's terrorism, bolstered by Hezbollah and Hamas. There's another trilateral border of Bolivia, Peru, and Chile, which once again is a center of Ayatollah's terrorist activities on the American continent. They bolster their presence in Central America, and they have a litany of sleeper cells in the US itself. And therefore, once they are identified as a major threat, it is incumbent upon responsible leaders to rid the region, the globe, from this threat. Certainly, when one knows that beginning January 20th, there will be a very different policy which would channel mega $billion to the terroristic coffers of the Ayatollahs. So personally, I hope that the Trump administration and Netanyahu administration will display global responsibility, will display concern for the safety of the people of the Middle East and beyond, and would act to end the regime in Iran, which has never been a partner to negotiations due to their own fanatical, megalomaniacal religious vision.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question, which we'll direct to Alex. But before we do, just a note to our audience that this webinar has been recorded and will be available on EMET's website tomorrow afternoon at emetonline.org. So the last question for Alex, what do you think will happen with U.S. relations with Israel if Kamala Harris takes over in comparison to the relations under Biden?
I think it's really very much the same regime in place. You know, we all saw the inability of Joe Biden to be out and about on a regular basis during the campaign season. You know, it's clear that he's not the Joe Biden that he was at full strength when he was a member of the Senate, and not even as he was the Vice President of the United States. So I don't think that you're going to see Biden flying to Israel and going to be the one that's leading the diplomatic foreign policy efforts. You're going to see a very active Secretary of State that's doing most of the bidding. And I think that Harris and Biden are really the two members of the same administration pushing the same agenda. So I don't think it makes too much of a difference.
Okay, we're about to close. First of all, I cannot thank my esteemed panel enough for their years and years of collective wisdom and experience and devotion to the cause of a greater U.S.-Israel relationship and how it is actually in America's best interest. You know, I always think about Alexander Haig and his analogy to Israel being better than the best, what is the word, Yoram?
Aircraft carrier.
Thank you, aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. And we'll be doing, you know, I am sure, unfortunately, Israel is going to be left alone in these next few years to do a lot of the heavy lifting and the hard work to keep America and a lot of the West alive. Another announcements, two announcements. Next Monday, we're going to be honored to have Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy, who are going to be talking about their wonderful new book, Never Alone, which talks basically about Natan Sharansky's exemplary life and everything that he has done for Israel and the Jewish people. And that will be at 12 noon next Monday. Do not miss it. And Gil Troy is a phenomenal historian and brilliant writer, and it'll be a treat to have them both. Also, next Tuesday is Giving Tuesday. We really do rely on contributions from viewers to keep ourselves alive. This has been a tough year for us, and a lot of our bigger donors were affected very badly by COVID-19. So if you listen to our webinars and you enjoy what we have to say, and if you realize all the stuff that we do every day on Capitol Hill, even throughout the pandemic, I'm asking you please to support us as generously as you possibly can. And while I'm at it, please support the wonderful writing and the great work of jns.org. Thank you very much, and thanks again to our wonderful panel.